This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com. Okay, we're going to work through question 1 of the paper F9 June 2010 exam. So first of all, let's have a look through the question as we would in the 15-minute reading time. If you look straight to the requirements, part A wants a list of values and fairly clearly its expected values, and that immediately put a few people off. However, part B is very, very standard. Identify and discuss factors to be considered in formulating a trade receivables management policy. That's pure writing, no numbers at all, and 8 marks. And part C, discuss whether profitability or liquidity is a primary objective of working capital management. A tiny bit unusual, but reasonably standard, and 4 marks. So there's 12 marks writing here. And provided you can do a reasonable written, then it doesn't matter if a few things go wrong in the arithmetic. Anyway, let's make a start. I'll start on part A. It wants expected values. Now, before we do it, when this exam was set, a lot of people got very upset by this question. They found part 1 very hard indeed. It was very unusual. It's not actually hard, but it's something he's never asked before, and to be honest, isn't so likely for the future. But it's worth having a look at for 2 reasons, or 3 reasons in fact. One, just to show how you can get pass marks relatively easily, even if you did find the whole thing difficult. Secondly, although as I said, it's not something you could expect to be asked terribly often, clearly it could be asked again. And once you've seen how to do it, it should be relatively easy. But thirdly, part A effectively is a simple bit of simulation. And several times you've been asked to mention that in written parts. And I think actually seeing it happen makes writing about it in other exams perhaps a bit easier. Anyway, let's have a go. A part 1 says the expected value of the period 1 closing balance. So now let's have a look at the information. ZSE is concerned about exceeding our overdraft limit of 2 million. We've been experiencing considerable volatility in recent periods. Customers have taken longer than the agreed credit period of 60 days. An increase in bad debts due to customers going into liquidation. However, now we get into the numbers. We've prepared the following forecasts of cash flows for the next 2 periods, together with their probabilities. So let's try and make sense of the table. Period 1 cash flow, we're either getting 8,000, appreciate they're all in thousands, so it's actually 8 million. But 8 million, 4 million, or minus 2 million with those probabilities. And period 2, the cash flow is 7, 3, minus 9 million, again with those probabilities. So we're told what the net cash flow is in each of the 2 periods, and we expect to be overdrawn at the start of the period by 500,000. Well, number 1, what's the expected value? Now, you should remember what expected values are from whatever studies you've done for F9, or certainly from paper F5 or even F2. And so part 1 just wants the expected value of the period 1 closing balances. So what are the possibilities? Remember, we started period 1, the last line of the question. We were overdrawn 500,000. Incidentally, I'll do everything in thousands. So we were overdrawn 500. And so the end of period closing balances we were negative 500. If we get 8,000 in, the closing balance is plus 7.5, minus 500, plus the 8,000 for the period. Similarly, if the cash flow in period 1 is 4,000, we started with an overdraft of 500, so we end up with a balance of 3,500. And finally, if the net cash flow is minus 2,000, well, we were already overdrawn 500, we end up minus 2,500. So there are the three possible closing balances. We know the probabilities, 0.1, 0.6, 0.3. The expected value, as I said, you should really be familiar with this. We simply multiply by the probabilities and add up. So let's see if I can get this right. 0.6 of 3,500 to 100. And 0.3 of minus 2,500 is minus 750, giving me an expected value of 2,100. Okay, in the exam that was only 2 marks, but that really should have been an easy 2 marks. Part 2 is a bit less obvious and does take a bit more time. In that, we already know that at the end of period 1, there are 3 possible closing balances. But in period 2, whatever the closing balance was at the end of period 1, there are then 3 net cash flows in period 2. So we're going to have to set up a full table. It's a little bit like something you should have done in paper F5. The point is, at the end of period 1, first of all, you could have ended up with a balance of 7,500. At the end of period 2, though, even if you had ended up with 7,500, period 2, you either get a net inflow of 7,000, in which case you end up with 14,500, or alternatively, you could have ended up with 7,500 and get a net cash inflow of 3,000, 10.5 at the end of period 2, or again, if we'd have ended up with 7.5, we might have got minus 9,000 in period 2. Now that's the 3 possibilities if period 1 ended with 7,500, but alternatively, period 1 could have ended up with 3,500. And again, we either get 7 or 3 or minus 9,000 in period 2, giving closing balances at the end of period 2 of 10,500, 6,500, or does that come to minus 5,500. By now you should be getting the idea. Finally, it could have been that period 1 ended up with 2,500 negative. And again, in period 2, we could have got an inflow of 7, an inflow of 3, an outflow of 9. And so the final closing balance at the end of period 2 in this situation could have been 4,500 negative, 500 positive. I'm sorry, I got the first one wrong. Oops. The first one, if we got 7,000 in period 2, we end up with 4,500 positive, 500 positive, or finally 11,500 negative. So those are all the possible closing balances at the end of period 2. A total of 9 possible outcomes. It wants an expected value, and so, like in part 1, we need to know the probabilities. And here's where a lot of people did have a problem. But learn from it, see the logic. First of all, how can we get the probability of having 7.5 in the first period and 7,000 in the second? Well, to get 7.5 in the first period, the probability was 0.1. I beg your pardon. Yes, it was 0.1. So it's only going to happen 10% of the time. In the second period, to get 7,000, the probability is 0.3. So 10% of the time we've got 7.5 in the first period. 30% of those 10% of the occasions we'll get 7,000 in the second. So in total, we multiply them together. The probability of getting 14,500, 7 happens 30% of the time. 30% of those 10% of the times that we got 7.5 in the first period. Now, if you need, sit and think about that for a minute or two, but once you've sorted that out, it then gets very easy. Again, to get 7.5 in the first is 0.1. To get 3 in the second is 0.5 from the question, so 0.05. 10% for 7.5, 0.2 for -9, 0.02, and so on. 3.5 in the first is 60%. 7 in the second is 30%. 60% and 50%. Finally, to get 2.5 at the end of the first period is 30%, and then carry on as before. There are the probabilities. And although obviously you don't want to waste time in the exam, there's a quick and I think obvious check, is that since we decided it'll be one of these 9 possible outcomes, the total of all the probabilities, it must equal 1. So 3, 5, 8, 16, 18, 27. Oh, it doesn't. I'll use my calculator. Yes, it does equal 1. However, we wanted the expected value, and now we can carry on as we did in part 1. The expected value, multiply, in each case, the net result, so 14,500 first of all, multiplied by the probability, and add up. So, 14,500 times 0.03 is 435. 10,500 times 0.05. 1,500 negative, remember, times 0.02. 10,500 times 0.18. 6,500 times 0.3. 5,500 times 0.12. 4,500 times 0.09. 500 times 0.15. And finally 11,500 times 0.06. Add them up. And I get the total to be 3,900. There is the expected value. Now, there were 5 marks for that, and there wasn't actually much time to think. I've taken a few minutes because I was talking. However, once you've once you're happy with the principle behind it, it is just speed on your calculator. And all right, even if there is the odd arithmetic mistake because you're rushing, that's only half a mark, as long as it's clear what you're doing. Parts 3 and 4, I think, are now very quick, but they do rely on us having got that table. Part 3 says, what's the probability of a negative cash balance at the end of period 1? Period 2, I beg your pardon. Well, negative cash balance occurs here, here, and here. So the 3 possible negative balances, and the probability of minus 1500 is 0.02. The probability of minus 5,500 is 0.12. Of minus 11,500 is 0.06. So if you prefer a 2%, a 12%, a 6% chance of them happening, the total chance of it being negative, 2 plus 12 plus 6, is what? 0.20 or 20%. So that was a quick one, but just 1 mark. Part 4 was, I think, 2 marks. The probability of exceeding the overdraft limit. Now, very quick here, provided you'd got that table. But the overdraft limit was how much? It was 2 million. The probability of exceeding it at the end of period 2. Well, when are we over 2 million? Either 5,500 or 11,500. So same idea as before. To be 5,500, the probability is 0.12. 11,500, 0.06. It's 0.18 or 18%. Finally, even if you did manage to get those correct, make sure you didn't waste 3 marks at the end, which you could have got probably most of those marks, even if you'd have got stuck on the numbers in part 2, 3, 4. It says, discuss whether the above analysis can assist the company in managing its cash flows. Well, he only gave 3 marks. He wasn't expecting much discussion, given there was all that arithmetic. But the points you need to make are the following. That although there's an expected closing balance of 3,900 positive, there are 2 big problems. One, obviously, is the accuracy of the probabilities. It says we've used a firm of financial consultants, but clearly those probabilities are only estimates, and with different probabilities a different answer. Secondly, though, and rather more importantly, this isn't something that's being repeated. If it was something that was being repeated lots and lots of times, then sometimes we'd get this outcome, sometimes we'd get this outcome, and so on. 3,9 would be the average. But it isn't being repeated lots of times, and the problem is, even though the average is 3,9, at the end of period 2, it'll be one of those 9 outcomes. Maybe you end up with a very high balance, great, but maybe you end up with a very big negative balance. And that's the real problem of using this. that the actual closing balance will not be 3,900. Again, I'm not going to write a long essay here, and you wouldn't expect a long essay, but it'll be one of those balances listed. And so actually more useful is what we did in part 4. Remember, our critical problem, it says in the first line, we're concerned about the overdraft exceeding 2 million. And although we acknowledge it might be higher, it might be lower, we do know that there's an 18% chance of the overdraft being exceeded. And therefore, if we do nothing at all, we are taking a risk. And so, are we prepared to take the risk? Because if not, we should look to raising extra finance. And you see, that's the useful one. There's always a risk, but if the probability of exceeding the overdraft was perhaps only 1%, maybe we'll take the risk. If the probability of exceeding it was 90%, then I think fairly obviously you're not going to take the risk. We can't make that decision. But that's what's somewhat more useful than the actual expected value. Anyway, I've gone on a bit too much there, for it was only 3 marks, but at the same time, it's 3 marks you can't afford to lose. You know, whether you got the earlier bits right or wrong. Part B is much more standard. I know most people don't like writing, but this is very, very standard. Identify and discuss the factors that should be considered in formulating a trade receivables management policy. And the 3 areas he expected you to discuss. Let's see, it was 8 marks, so he wasn't wanting much discussion about each. Have a read of his answer, but remember, he says more always than he expects. But the 3 stages, the 3 things to consider. Trade receivables management. We're talking about giving credit to customers. So the first thing that needs asking is, if a new customer appears, how much credit shall we give? If it's a new customer, we perhaps won't give them a very high credit limit initially. If it's an established customer who's been paying on time, maybe we'll increase the credit limit. So the amount of the credit limit if it's new customers, well, before you sell on credit to a new customer, you want to check their credit worthiness. You'll do things like ask for references from the bank or from other people they've done business with. You'll look at their accounts. Certainly, if you're talking about large amounts. Excuse me. Existing customers. Well, the amount of their credit limit, you'll look at the past history. What I mean by that is, have they been paying on time? If they've been a good customer in the past, then, as I said, perhaps you'll increase the credit limit. If they've been a bad customer, surely you're more likely to reduce it. Anyway, that's the first thing you consider, how much credit to allow customers. The second thing is we're going to have credit control or monitoring. It ties in with what we've just said, but a good monitoring policy. And by monitoring, check if they're paying on time. Have a standard policy for chasing them. Things like for example, statements once a month. And finally, collection procedures. We will monitor, but the point is, what are we going to do if we find somebody is late paying? We're not just going to sit there and wait. We need procedures in place, standard policies. For example, maybe a threatening letter. By threatening, I don't mean anything evil, but just saying, you're a month overdue. If you don't pay, then we'll go to court, something like that. Lawyers' letters. Collection agencies. And again, our standard procedure, after 1 month, we send them a letter saying pay within 1 week or something. Maybe after 2 months, we send a letter from a lawyer saying it'll be passed to a collection agency. Maybe after 3 months, we do pass it to a collection agency. The point is, we need standard procedures. Finally, a nice little one. Again, it's only 7 marks, but still. Discuss whether profitability or liquidity is the primary objective of working capital management. The company has 2 objectives, surely, or several objectives, but certainly there's the profit objective overall, to satisfy shareholders. On the other hand, and certainly more concerned with working capital, the liquidity objective we need that objective, basically, can we pay our bills? So both objectives are important. And liquidity, as I say, is more working capital. The only problem is they can conflict. The obvious example of where they can conflict is cash balances. For liquidity, clearly you want to hold cash. Make sure we've got enough cash to pay the bills. The problem is that cash does not earn much. Now that's all he wanted. The importance of the two objectives. We do want both, and again, that's really what we're looking at in working capital measures. But the point is, because there is this conflict, we need to strike a balance. We want to be a reasonable level of working capital. For liquidity purposes, but not let it get too high. Because then profits will suffer. So that's for liquidity. Not to get too high because of profits suffer. Okay, there we are.